Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Risen 2 Dark Waters for PC, Xbox 360, and PlayStation 3. This is an action RPG by Piranha Bytes published by Deep Silver in April of last year, starting with PC version, and then in the following months you saw releases of the console versions. And it's kind of interesting because they dropped what the original Risen did, which was a fairly standard fantasy role-playing game in a lot of ways. It was a pretty hardcore role-playing game where you really had to pay a lot of attention to what you were doing. Not a lot of people really got into it, but if you see my review of it, which I will have an annotation up for if you want to look at that, if you see my review of it, you know that I rather liked it despite its faults. And with Risen 2, they decided to go a decidedly different theme. They went with the full-on pirate theme. And that begs the question, how did they pull it off? Well, as far as the presentation goes, it's not really any step up or step down from Risen 1. They did change up a few things here and there, and it fits the pirate theme a lot better, with the environments and such being this very tropical kind of environment. It very much fits the Caribbean pirate sort of thing. They definitely nailed the visual aesthetic with that. But at the same time, they have some oddities here and there, like the running animations looking really robotic for some reason, and in fact a lot of the animations in the game look really robotic. Some look better than others, but it's an oddity. Facial animations tend to look kind of goofy and old-fashioned, so to speak. The texture quality is decent, but nothing particularly impressive. Modeling is actually pretty good for the most part. There's some weird things here and there, but for the most part they did a good job with it. And there's a bunch of weird graphics glitches throughout the game where, for instance, if you're trying to dig up a treasure, then if you've got a musket on your back, which is where it's housed if you're not using it, it will flip 180 degrees on your back for no reason. And you just sit there going, what? Okay? And that doesn't happen with swords or anything, so it's just kind of odd. There's also some weird issues with the plants growing as you get closer to them and shrinking as you get further away. And it just looks odd. It's something you have to get used to. It's how they actually dealt with loading stuff into the world and making sure that it could run well enough. So it's a weird measure, and I understand why they did it. It's such an odd way of doing it that you can't help but notice it and be like, what? As far as the sound design goes, it's kind of all over the place. You have the voice acting, which for the most part is just at best. They do their job, and that's about all they need to do, and there are some characters that are more annoying than others. Some characters just sound ridiculously goofy. You'll notice a lot of repeated voices. It's just a side effect of the way they've developed the game, and while it's nothing that'll really put you off, it's something you have to get used to, and it can be annoying at times. Plus, there's a lot of profanity in this game for no particular reason, particularly with the character Jafar, or as he pronounces it, Jaffa. And every single thing he says is punctuated with "fuck yes." You just go, why? Why? Anyway. The music is pretty fitting for the game. It does certainly fit the tropical theme as well as this sort of fantasy theme, but it doesn't really fit the pirate theme all that well. And so it takes more after the original Risen than it does with Risen 2. It's an odd thing, but it's pretty decent music, and it works well for what it is. The only thing you'll probably find annoying are the sound effects. Well, besides the voice acting, I mean. The sound effects are pretty much stock. Guns sound pretty standard. They don't sound particularly beefy or powerful unless you happen to get lucky and trigger a certain sound effect with them. They do look impressive with the humongous puffs of smoke and everything, so that's actually pretty accurate to black powder weapons. But the sound effects are just kind of standard gun sound effects, and so this is like, eh. The melee sound effects are actually rather unimpressive, so when you're doing melee combat, it's something that the sound effects don't really engage you, so to speak, and nor do the animations for that matter, so there's a missed opportunity there. But what really matter are the story and the gameplay. And the story in this is, I guess the best way to describe it initially is interesting. You play as the same guy you played in the original Risen, the nameless hero, and you find out immediately that you're apparently a drunkard now, and you have an eye patch for reasons that are not explained in the game, and you look nothing like you did in the original game, and for some reason you don't have any of the abilities that you had in the original game. You are now a weakling for some bizarre reason that they never explain. I guess that's what the drunkard thing is for. Anyway, you're part of the Inquisition now, and you find yourself on the Isle of Caldera, which is a very lava-spewy island, and you find out it's like that because the Titans Ursagor and Ismail are fighting in the background, and you never see this happen, of course. And basically, Caldera is all that's left of the old Empire. The old Empire was effectively destroyed except for this one section of the island. And so, the people of Caldera are effectively trying to evacuate to the New World. The problem there being that the Titan Mara has decided, hey, I'm just going to wreck your stuff. And so, she controls the seas, effectively. And particularly with, of course, the Kraken. Gotta have the Kraken in a game like this, right? Anyway. So the basic plot of the game is you ending up going undercover because you find out that the pirate Captain Steelbeard, who was referenced in the original game, of course, has a way to defeat Mara. And so you're effectively going undercover as a pirate in order to find the Titan artifacts and thus defeat Mara. Story in a nutshell right there. It's not a good story. Now, don't get me wrong, the original Risen story wasn't good either. But it wasn't that bad. It was just something that happened to hold the game together to some degree. It kind of got annoying sometimes. But in this case, it's downright pathetic. The story doesn't really make any sense. And it really doesn't make any sense when you combine it with the fact that suddenly everything is a couple hundred years into the future as far as the tech level goes and the styling and all that sort of thing. If you played the original Risen, you know that it was pretty much a medieval fantasy game set in a tropical environment. And when you get to Risen 2, suddenly, it's like Pirates of the Caribbean. It's basically the 1700s, so you find that the tech level has suddenly become, everything is flintlocks, and there's guns, and cannons, and how? Just why? All of a sudden we have this stuff, and where did magic go? Oh, it's voodoo now. Oh, okay. Effectively, they destroyed the setup that they had in the original Risen and said, screw that, we're going with something completely different for gimmick's sake. Because the pirate theme, it really doesn't work out in this game's favor. It pretty much breaks the game, actually, in a lot of ways. So, obviously, the storyline's pretty pathetic, and in fact, the conclusion to it is just, I was just sitting there like, really? You went there? Okay, this is going to be stupid. At any rate, when you get to the end of the game, you find that it doesn't actually resolve all that much of the plot. It resolves the plot that you're going for, but that's it. That's the only part of the plot that's actually resolved. You still got Ursagor and Ismail fighting in the background. You still got the whole Caldera situation. They don't even mention that. It's just like, okay, guys, maybe you should mention this. Oh well, whatever. I guess that's what they're setting up for Risen 3? I don't know. Anyway. Plotline of the game is rather pathetic, and it actually ends up being really annoying in a lot of spots because they try to go for cliches. They try to work in the pirate theme and fail miserably at it most of the time. It's just pathetic. And so, what about the gameplay? Does that prop it up? Well, first off, you have to remember that this is the sequel to the original Risen. And I rather like the original Risen, mostly for its gameplay rather than the story and everything. And what made Risen good, as far as the gameplay went, was its very good timing-based combat system and the exploration side of things. It was really all the side stuff you could do. It's like with the Gothic series, where the exploration and the combat and everything are really the the parts of the gameplay that hold everything else up and make everything even better. Well, in Risen 2 they said, screw that, we're going with something else. That's a problem, because the combat system in Risen, well, I'll get to that in a minute. The exploration side of things is actually quite a bit like the original Risen, except it's a lot more limited. The islands that you're going to are nowhere near as big as the environment that you were going around in Risen 1, and I think that's because they tried to put multiple islands in there. Unfortunately, everything feels kind of samey except for one island in particular, and that's the Isle of the Dead. And that's really the only interesting location in the entire game. You don't have these really interesting ruins that you can explore or anything like that. I mean, they do exist in some spots, but they're few and far between. You don't really have all that many locations that you can go into and be like, wow, this is really cool. Oh, look, there's a really powerful enemy. If I come back later, I'll be able to defeat it, and there's probably something really good there. In fact, they don't usually reward your exploration as well as they did in the original Risen. And part of this ties in with the rest of the gameplay as well. But I never really felt like the exploration in Risen rewarded me properly for what I was doing. Particularly early on in the game, because it kept blocking off things and saying, hey, you're going to need way higher skills in order to be able to access this thing. And this was the beginning of the game, like an hour into it. So that was already annoying. And when you get to the rest of the gameplay with the combat system and the modified stat and skill system, then things go all over the place. As far as the stats go, I do like what they did with that in one particular aspect, which is the level up system. Now, in the original Risen, you would eventually get learning points, and you would basically spend those in order to upgrade your strength and all that sort of thing, as well as your skills. But you also had to pay gold to do that. In this case, you spend your experience points, which are now called glory points, in order to up your stats, which are blades, firearms, cunning, toughness, and voodoo. And yes, voodoo has replaced the magic in this thing. I'll get to that in a moment. But you have all these different things, and you spend your glory points to upgrade those. Now, it's rather expensive in the glory points side of things, but I noticed that by the end of the game, when I was actually diversifying my stats rather widely, and so I actually ended up with some pretty high stats by the end of the game. So it's not like glory points are a problem, particularly if you're going for a certain build. As long as you do all the side stuff, you find all the various artifacts and stuff like that. But it's actually a better system than the original Risen, because now you don't have to spend gold in order to increase your stats. You just had to spend gold in order to increase your skills. Now, whenever you increase an attribute in this game with the blades, the firearms, whatever, you also increase its talents. Now, there are 3 talents for each. For instance, under firearms, there are muskets, pistols, and shotguns. And when you increase your firearms stat, it will increase those 3 talents as well. And you also have skills that you can learn, and those are the various things that will be taught by various people throughout the game. And the talents increase. You also get items that will increase the talents. You can find various herbs and such like that will also increase your talents. And in one particular aspect, the cunning stat with its thievery talent is particularly noteworthy, because you're going to need that really badly throughout the entire game, or else you won't be able to afford anything. Yeah, gold is one of the big things in Risen 2, and it was also in Risen 1, and it was actually more of a problem in Risen 1. But in this game, you're basically going to be swimming in loot if you really up your thievery skill to the max. You do need certain levels of your stats in order to get certain skills. For instance, there's a skill for the firearms. I believe it requires firearms level 4 in order to get it. It's called Nuff Said. And this actually highlights a big problem with some of the stuff in the game, by the way. But this particular skill allows you to, in the middle of a conversation, to just whip out your pistol and blast the guy in the face. Which sounds really handy in a lot of ways, and it sounds very piratey, actually. But there's one problem with that. It's used maybe 4 times in the entire game. So, that's a problem, if you didn't know this already. The problem being that a lot of the stuff in this thing is really underused. And, in fact, some of the skills end up being pretty much useless, like parrots, for instance. You can get parrots in this game. It's a very high-level cunning skill. It requires a maxed-out cunning stat. But there's no point in getting it because the parrots are pretty much useless. I certainly never needed them throughout the game, and all they really do is distract an enemy for a bit. I did get the monkey training skill, but the only problem with that being that I only used the monkey once, and that was only to find this one artifact that I needed. And so, it's just, like, why do they put this stuff in there if you're not going to use it, you know? And, so, a lot of these skills and such come off as just half-baked. It's like, why did they even put this in there if they're not going to use it? Like the distillery skill. You can distill liquor, mostly grog and rum in this case, and it's effectively replaced the potion-making skill from the previous game, which was really incredibly useful. You'd brew all sorts of great potions that would increase your stats, or get a lot of healing potions, such like that. You'll find a ton of herbs and such in this game that you can't even use. So, that's just annoying. And so, when you get through this game, you'll find that a lot of the stuff in it is just really underused. In one case, that's really bad throughout the entire game, voodoo. Which sounds cool, right? Cursed dolls, that sort of thing. Well, guess what? Voodoo's ludicrously underpowered, so there's really no point in even getting it. And that's one of the, actually the major choice throughout the entire game. It's whether you side with the natives and thus get access to voodoo, or you side with the Inquisition and thus get access to muskets. Well, that's kind of clear-cut, because muskets are ridiculously overpowered in this thing. They do ludicrous amounts of damage and reload in 2 seconds. Yes, 2 seconds. For a musket. Yeah, makes perfect sense, doesn't it? At any rate, the muskets are ludicrously overpowered, and in fact, I found that they broke the game when I got to the combat. So, what about the combat? Well, guess what? Combat's crap. Now, it doesn't help that you have to learn how to kick. You have to pay someone to teach you how to kick. Yes. Sounds fantastic, doesn't it? Anyway, it doesn't help that you have to get taught how to kick. But really the combat in general is just incredibly broken. You have melee system that, if they just used the melee system from the original Risen, it would have been great, because that system actually was really good. It worked out really well. But they didn't do that. Instead, they threw in a pretty generic melee system, and you basically just click, 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 and things fall over. Eventually, if they stop blocking, which takes a while. But anyway, you do get access to stuff like power attacks and counters and such like that, but it really doesn't help you out all that much in the long run. And so, you'll find that the only thing that'll really help you out is when you get access to one of those basically relic blades that effectively does ludicrous amounts of damage. Like the one I got did 60 to 100 damage per hit, whereas my musket did 75 per hit. So it was pretty ridiculous. At any rate, the combat in the game, unlike, say, the original Risen, isn't very much of an interesting part of the game. You mostly spend it just fighting the same few enemies throughout the entirety of the game. You get so tired of fighting sand devils, trust me. But you also fight a ton of giant crabs, and yes, they do have a weak point you can attack for massive damage, but you have to have the kick skill first. Yeah, you kick them and then they fly on their back and then they just kind of flail around for a bit while you just whack their underbelly. And so that's really the only use you'll ever have for the kick skill. Ever. Is fighting giant crabs. And guess what? Toward the end of the game, they don't even have giant crabs anymore. It's stupid. And when you're fighting human enemies, the pirates mostly, you'll find that, oh dear God, they're hard to kill. Because they do tons of damage when they hit you. You don't do all that much damage when you hit them until later on in the game. And they're way better shots than you are. For instance, if you try to use your pistol, which is an offhand weapon now, you hit the... it's basically the dirty tricks button, but you have your pistol equipped instead. You just whip out your pistol and fire a single shot at the enemy and then stick it back on your belt. Now, in theory, this would be great, because it does a lot of damage when it hits. Problem being, it has a really short range, and you'll miss half the time. At least until you get really late in the game and your pistol skill is ludicrously high. And then you're hitting pretty much every shot, and even then, there are certain enemies where you just miss constantly, and it's really annoying. But basically, once you get muskets, the combat's over. You just basically run circles around your enemy and keep shooting them until they fall over. Makes combat really boring. And, in particular, when you get to the end game, the combat becomes really tedious, because it's just fighting the same few enemies over and over and over again, and you're just so tired of it. But, what about the rest of the stuff in this game? The side quests and all that? Well, they do have quite a few side quests, and most of them are pretty simplistic. They're just doing jobs for people. There is actually a series of sort of quests where you have to go find buried treasure or find various artifacts that will increase your stats and such like that. And those are actually kind of cool to some degree. Finding the artifacts was really the coolest thing there, because they each have their own backstories and everything. And that was really the only indication I got where it was really trying to put in some pirate lore. It's like, we're trying to put as much piratey stuff into these artifacts as possible, but the rest of the game can just screw it. Yeah, screw that. And it's really just shows a lot of mixed priorities. It's like they just tacked the pirate theme on at the end and said, okay, now just have all these backstories for these artifacts, and then we'll figure something out for the rest of the game. It's a mess. Now, when you get through the rest of the game, you'll find that despite what a lot of people would have you believe, this is not a horrible game. It is not atrocious, like a lot of people seem to think it is. It's not good either, but it's not atrocious. What it is mediocre. The combat just isn't interesting. The story is awful. The characters, while some of them are slightly interesting, mostly just get kind of annoying. Like Jaffa, who is the gnome that becomes part of your crew. Yes, you get a crew in this game. You eventually get your own ship and your own crew. The problem being that it doesn't really go anywhere. But those characters just aren't very interesting. I mean, Jaffa is basically the only interesting one. So is Patty. But they're basically just wisecracking, and all Jaffa does is run around and go fuck yes to everything. So it just gets kind of annoying in a lot of ways. Now, I did mention the pirate ship and the crew thing, but that, again, that doesn't go anywhere. You can't go on raids or anything like that. You just sail from island to island, and then you might ask one of your crew to accompany you. And some of them do have their own benefits and such like that, but most of them just, they're just going to sit on the ship. And in fact, most of the game I just ran around on my own and did nothing, because the companion AI in this game isn't really that good. Whenever you have to have somebody following you around for a quest, it gets really annoying, trust me. And so, Risen 2 has a lot of problems. And while the concept is interesting, it would be really interesting to see a really good pirate role-playing game. I mean, think about it. There's tons of potential there. The problem being, they completely squandered every last bit of potential in this thing. And the game ended up being really mediocre as a result. All of the elements blending together, if they worked, would have been really cool. If the voodoo worked, it would have been really awesome. If the muskets weren't ludicrously overpowered, then the combat might have been interesting. If they kept the combat system from Risen 1, it might have been interesting. If the plot was better, it might have been a really good game. But, again, it all blends together and makes a really mediocre game. I give it a 2 out of 5. Thanks for watching.